So you're saying the regulatory risk overblown? Why?
Well, basically, in Korea, we saw this relatively earlier than other markets because of how mature the online economies has been. So we have gone through a lot of these controversies surrounding the big tech relatively earlier than other markets. And there are some regulations and policies in place to put a check and balance on these companies. And the companies like Naver for a long time has been dealing with these issues. Kakao is under a bit of a spotlight recently because of the size that they've become. So the point being that a lot of the regulations that could potentially impede their earnings are already in the place, and they've been sort of adjusting their business model to cater towards the regulations.
In essence, it's done with. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yes.
There's not really so much of an overhang as there is with some other jurisdictions where people are just waiting for the next lot to come through.
Well, yes and no, because again, I think the process of modernizing the law that has been written before the digitalization era is actually an agenda for any nations in this world. And the same thing applies to Korea as well. So regulation overhang is here to stay. But on the other hand, if you look at the companies where they're getting their earnings from and their revenue growth from, there are necessary regulations in place and they're abiding by the law. And if we think about what are going to be the next regulations, then it's really difficult to see what the government can actually do to impede their future revenue growth. That means that it is a buying opportunity for us in our view.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up because I guess my question is, would you necessarily now be attaching a slightly different multiple, future multiple on the stock moving forward because of maybe the slight differences because of regulation?
Yes, so sorry, I missed your question.
Oh, I was basically asking, when you look at the earnings capacity for the companies that you cover, including Coupang, for example, because of regulation, it might not be material, but it does change certain things at the fringe. Would that change the way or the multiples that you would attach to these stocks when you do your valuations?
Yeah, that's a good question. So clearly the market haven't actually factored in these externalities that could impact the sentiment on the overall stocks. So that's already in place, and we have seen the share price corrections for Korean-related names. So now, we have to decide at some point then when do we draw the line and we expect the sentiment to turn again. And then we are looking at the good earnings growth outlook driven by e-commerce and advertising, which there is no impact because of regulations or new regulations that are likely to come on. That means we think there is a good buying opportunity somewhere down the line.
And it's not just domestic tech, right? We've seen regulators crack down on the likes of Google, blocking them from taking ownership of these payments, right? So how does that change, do you think, the balance of these super apps right now in Korea?
Yes, that balance is actually a very good word. So right now we are looking at the balance coming from the traditional industry's perspective. But on the other hand, there is a balance that we need to think about giving more consumer benefits and consumer convenience and protecting the consumer rights. And that balance is coming through because we already started to see some of the remarks from the ministers of ministries that we need to think about innovation. We need to think about room for disruptions to continuously innovate our industry. So that's actually coming through, which I think it will be a point where we start buying the stocks again.
So of course, getting back to the heart of the problem, and it is global, as you've already said. So it is the ecosystem itself, this new ecosystem, and the old legislation which is there when trying to get these two to marry each other, to meet, and that's the mismatch. How long will that take? It's going to be different in different countries and territories, isn't it? And so in one place, something could be illegal, in the other, totally legal. So,
right.
This is the problem, isn't it?
Yes, it is a problem and it's a challenge, and I think where the regulation actually adds value, because we need to think about how do we actually reduce the gray area and obviously make it clearer for any players, whether it be digital or offline, actually play in a level playing field. And that's how the regulation, we think, ultimately is a positive driver for the industry players, including investors as well.